The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the isolated farmhouse. Margaret Voss didn't flinch. She had been expecting it. For 3 long years, she had prayed it would never come to this. But deep down, she had known it would. As Rex's pained yelp faded into silence, something else awakened in the 62-year-old widow. Something that had been dormant since her military days. Something her husband had helped her lock away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The men outside, 5 of them according to her security cameras, laughed in the darkness. They thought they had neutralized a threat. Instead, they had triggered a protocol that her late husband, James, had helped her design, a final fail-safe. First Rex, then the widow Voss, one of them called out. Then this prime piece of property is up for grabs. What they didn't know was that Margaret wasn't just a widow. Before becoming Mrs. Voss, she had been Staff Sergeant Margaret Collins, Special Forces, with confirmed kills in 3 different conflict zones. And the death of Rex wasn't a setback in her defense. It was the signal to begin. As she reached for the hidden compartment beneath her kitchen island, Margaret whispered, "You shot the wrong dog, boys." Margaret's hands didn't shake as she clicked open the false panel built into the underside of her kitchen island. James had installed it 6 years ago, back when his cancer was still just a distant concern rather than the enemy that would eventually take him. "For when I'm gone," he had said, his voice pragmatic despite the morbidity of the conversation. Inside the hidden compartment lay a satellite phone, a small metal key, and a sealed envelope with her name written in James's neat handwriting. She had never opened it before, honoring his request to save it for when she truly needed it. Tonight, I qualified. The farmhouse sat on 80 acres of prime riverside land that developers had been eyeing for years. Ever since James passed, the offers had come in steadily, each one more aggressive than the last. 3 months ago, they had stopped being offered and started becoming threats. Last week, Rex had found a small incendiary device by the barn, meant to scare, not destroy, a warning. Margaret tore open the envelope as the men outside split up to surround the house. The letter inside was brief. "Maggie, if you're reading this, it means Rex is gone and you're alone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. Remember Tanzania, same principle." The key opens the gun cabinet in the root cellar. The phone has 1 number programmed in. Call it after, not before. They think you're just a widow. Show them Staff Sergeant Collins instead. "I love you. See you on the other side, but not too soon. Always yours, James." A small smile touched Margaret's lips. Tanzania, 2001. A hostage extraction gone sideways when their cover was blown. She and James had been outnumbered 8-1. They'd walked out with every hostage and only minor injuries. It had been the mission where they'd first acknowledged their feelings for each other. Huddled in a safe house waiting for extraction, covered in someone else's blood. Margaret pocketed the phone and key, then moved to the living room window. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see 2 men approaching the front porch. One carried what looked like bolt cutters. For the security chain, she presumed, the other held a handgun loosely at his side, probably the one who had shot Rex. Her heart clenched momentarily at the thought of her faithful companion, but she pushed the grief aside. There would be time for mourning later. At 62, Margaret wasn't as spry as she once had been. Her joints ached when it rained, and the old shrapnel wound in her thigh sometimes flared up. But as she silently made her way to the kitchen door that led to the cellar, muscle memory from decades of training took over. Her footsteps became lighter, her breathing controlled. She moved like a shadow through her own home. The root cellar was accessible through a heavy trapdoor in the pantry floor. Margaret descended the narrow stairs, the familiar smell of earth and preserved vegetables filling her nostrils. At the far end, behind shelves of canned tomatoes and pickled beets from last season's harvest, stood what appeared to be an ordinary gun cabinet. But when she inserted James's key into what looked like a standard lock, then turned it while simultaneously pressing a hidden lever underneath, the entire cabinet slid sideways, revealing a second, more robust cabinet behind it. This was James's insurance policy, his parting gift to her. The interior was illuminated by a small battery-powered light that activated when the cabinet opened. Inside were 3 firearms: a Remington 870 shotgun, a Sig Sauer P2 handgun, and an AR-15 with a suppressor. Below them sat boxes of ammunition, a tactical vest, night vision goggles, and a small medical kit. Margaret reached for the shotgun first. Close-quarters defense was her priority, then loaded the Sig and secured it in the holster attached to the tactical vest. As she donned the vest, adjusting it to fit her frame, a crash echoed from upstairs. They were inside, sooner than she had anticipated. "Check the bedroom," a gruff voice commanded. "Find the old lady." Margaret's expression hardened. Old lady! That's what they saw when they looked at her. A vulnerable widow alone on a valuable piece of property, an easy target. They hadn't bothered to research who they were dealing with. A critical mistake in her former line of work. She took a moment to center herself, to recall the layout of her home from this tactical perspective. 5 intruders, 1 likely at the back door as a lookout. 2 had entered through the front. The remaining 2 were probably covering other entry points or preparing to search the outbuildings. The element of surprise was her greatest advantage. They didn't expect resistance, certainly not organized, trained resistance. In their minds, they were hunting prey. They didn't realize they had wandered into the territory of a predator. Margaret switched off the cellar light and stood in darkness, letting her eyes adjust. She could hear the men moving above her, their heavy footfalls causing dust to drift down from between the floorboards. They were making no effort to be quiet. Another mistake. The trapdoor to the cellar was hidden under a kitchen rug. If they were thorough, they'd find it eventually, but Margaret had no intention of waiting. She made her way up the stairs, shotgun at the ready. At the top, she paused, listening. 1 set of footsteps in the kitchen, moving toward the living room. Another, heavier set in the bedroom. The back door creaked, a 3rd man entering. Margaret eased the trapdoor open just enough to peer through. The kitchen was momentarily empty. She slipped out, closing the trapdoor silently behind her, then positioned herself beside the refrigerator, concealed from the living room entrance. "Nothing in the bedroom except old lady stuff," called a voice. "Medicines, romance novels. No sign of her." "She's got to be here somewhere," responded another voice from the living room. "Her car's still in the garage. Check the bathrooms." The man from the bedroom walked into the kitchen, passing within 2 feet of Margaret without seeing her. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a patchy beard and a nervous energy to his movements. The pistol in his hand looked too large for him, and he held it like someone who had learned to shoot from movies rather than training. As he turned toward the hallway bathroom, Margaret stepped out and pressed the barrel of the shotgun to the base of his skull. "Drop it," she whispered. The young man froze, then let the pistol clatter to the floor. Margaret kicked it away, then added, "On your knees, hands behind your head." "Jake, can you find anything?" called the man from the living room. Margaret leaned close to the young man's ear. "Tell him no. Tell him you're checking the backyard next." Sweat beaded on Jake's forehead as he called back, his voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "Nothing here. Gonna check outside, see if she ran off. Make it quick, we need to finish this and get out before anyone notices the dog." Margaret processed this information. They were worried about being noticed, which meant this wasn't a sanctioned operation. Likely hired muscle rather than professionals. That improved her odds considerably. "How many exactly are you with?" she whispered to Jake. 5 total, he murmured, confirming her count. Please don't kill me. I just drive for them. I didn't even know what this was about until we got here. Where are the others positioned? Mitch is in the living room. Decker's watching the back. Harlan and Cruz are checking the barn. Margaret nodded. Who shot my dog? Jake swallowed hard. Harlan said it was necessary. I wouldn't have. Save it, Margaret cut him off. Necessary, as if anything about this invasion was necessary, as if Rex had posed any real threat to armed men. They had killed him to make a point, to demonstrate their dominance. It was the kind of casual cruelty that Margaret had witnessed too often in war zones, the strong preying on the perceived weak simply because they could. She made a quick decision. Jake was young, frightened, and possibly salvageable. Here's what's going to happen. You're going into the pantry. You're going to sit there silently until this is over. If you make a sound, try to warn your friends or attempt to leave, I will find you, and unlike your employer, I don't make idle threats. Understand? Jake nodded vigorously. Margaret marched him to the pantry, secured the door with a chair, then considered her next move. The man in the living room, Mitch, was her most immediate concern. The two at the barn would take time to return to the house, giving her a window to deal with the closer threats first. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She moved toward the living room, keeping close to the wall. Through the doorway, she could see a large man rifling through her desk drawers. He wore a leather jacket, despite the warm June night, likely concealing a weapon. On the coffee table lay an open folder, her property documents, which had been stored in the desk. So this was about the land, as she had suspected. The development company had finally decided that a cash offer wasn't going to work and had moved on to more direct methods. Margaret weighed her options. She could incapacitate Mitch, then deal with the man at the back door, which would leave only the two at the barn. But if anyone fired a weapon, the noise would alert the others. The element of surprise would be lost. As if sensing her thoughts, Mitch's hand moved to his jacket, withdrawing a walkie-talkie. "Barn team report," he said into the device. "Find anything?" A crackling voice responded, "Place is empty. Lots of farming equipment, some old furniture, no sign of the woman." "Hurry it up," Mitch replied. "Jake's checking the yard, Decker's on the back, but we need to wrap this up." Margaret tensed as Mitch turned in her direction. For a moment she thought he had spotted her, but he was just scanning the room restlessly. She noticed a tattoo on his neck, a stylized $sign. Mercenary work, then. Hired by someone with money, but without the stomach to do their own dirty work. As Mitch turned back to the desk, Margaret made her move. 3 quick steps brought her into the living room, shotgun leveled at his chest. "Looking for me?" she asked. To his credit, Mitch didn't panic. His eyes widened slightly, but otherwise his expression remained composed as he slowly raised his hands. "Mrs. Voss," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "This doesn't have to get messy. We're just here to deliver a message." "By shooting my dog and breaking into my home?" Margaret kept the shotgun steady. "Seems plenty messy already." Mitch's eyes flickered to something behind her, and Margaret instinctively ducked as a shot rang out. The bullet embedded itself in the wall, where her head had been a moment before. She spun, firing the shotgun in one fluid motion. The blast caught the man from the back door, Decker, presumably, in the shoulder, sending him crashing into the china cabinet. Porcelain shattered as he fell. Margaret was already moving, knowing Mitch would use the distraction to reach for his weapon. She slammed the butt of the shotgun into his solar plexus as he lunged for her, then followed with a strike to his jaw that sent him sprawling across the coffee table. Years of training and muscle memory compensated for age and rustiness. Margaret had been a hand-to-hand combat instructor at Fort Benning for 3 years before her final deployment. The techniques were ingrained in her body, requiring little conscious thought. Mitch recovered quickly, rolling to his feet with surprising agility for his size. He had a knife now, a wicked hunting blade, that gleamed in the dim light of the living room. He held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "Not bad for an old lady," he said, circling her cautiously. "But you're outnumbered and outgunned. The property developer just wants you gone. Doesn't have to be in a body bag, but that's an option." "Which developer?" Margaret asked, buying time as she positioned herself to keep both Mitch and the wounded Decker in view. "Morrison, Blackwell Estates," Mitch sneered. "Above my pay grade, lady. I just do the job and collect the check." Margaret had suspected as much. These weren't corporate raiders, they were hired thugs sent to frighten her off her land. It wasn't an uncommon tactic in rural areas where local law enforcement might be understaffed or easily influenced. Outside, a voice called, "Mitch, we heard shots. What's happening?" The barn team was returning. Margaret needed to end this confrontation quickly. Mitch smiled. "Cavalry's arriving. Last chance to be reasonable, Mrs. Voss. Sign the papers, take a generous payment and disappear. Or don't disappear. That works too." Margaret shook her head. "This land isn't for sale. Not to intimidators, not to developers, not to anyone. It was my husband's legacy." "Your husband is dead," Mitch said flatly, "and you're about to join him unless you wise up." The casual cruelty of the statement, the dismissal of James's memory, ignited something in Margaret that 3 years of widowhood had dampened. A cold fury that she had once channeled in combat situations, that James had helped her control and eventually lock away when they retired to civilian life. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice eerily calm. "My husband is dead, but he taught me everything I know." She feinted left, then pivoted right as Mitch lunged with the knife. In the same motion, she brought the shotgun up and fired. Not at Mitch, but at the propane lantern hanging on the wall behind him. The room exploded in a burst of flame and shattered glass. Mitch instinctively covered his face, giving Margaret the opening she needed. The second blast from the shotgun caught him in the leg, dropping him to the floor with a howl of pain. Margaret was already moving toward the wounded Decker, who was fumbling for the pistol he had dropped. "Don't," she warned, leveling the shotgun at him. Footsteps thundered on the porch. The barn team had arrived. Margaret grabbed Mitch's walkie-talkie from where it had fallen. "Harlan Cruz, if you value your lives, listen carefully," she said into the device. "I have your friends. One is bleeding badly. The other won't walk again without surgery and physical therapy. I'm giving you one chance to retreat. Take it." There was a long pause before a gravelly voice responded. "How do we know they're alive?" Margaret pressed the walkie-talkie to Mitch's mouth. "Tell them," Mitch, pale from pain and blood loss, gasped. "It's a set-up. She's ex-military or something." "Get out and call." Margaret pulled the device away. "You've heard enough. Leave my property now, or I will start sending out bodies." Another pause, longer this time. Then the voice said, "We're leaving the porch. Coming around to the front window, so you can see us." Margaret moved cautiously to the window, keeping the shotgun trained on her 2 captives. Outside, 2 figures appeared in the glow of the security light, hands raised. One was a heavy-set man with a bushy beard. Harlan, she guessed, the one who had shot Rex. The other was taller, thinner, with the watchful movements of someone accustomed to violence. "Slide your weapons onto the porch," Margaret commanded through the walkie-talkie. "Then back away to your vehicle." The men complied, each placing a handgun on the porch before retreating toward a black SUV parked on the gravel driveway. "What about our friends?" "The bearded one," Harlan called out. Margaret considered her options. These men had invaded her home, killed her companion, and threatened her life. In a combat situation, the decision would be clear, but this wasn't war. Not technically. And despite everything, Margaret wasn't a killer by nature. It had been a skill learned out of necessity, not desire. They'll need medical attention, she replied finally. Once you're gone, I'll call an ambulance. Whether the police come with it depends on how quickly and quietly you disappear. The two men exchanged glances, then the taller one nodded. They continued backing toward their vehicle. In the living room, Decker moaned in pain. Mitch had grown quiet, his face ashen as blood pooled beneath his wounded leg. Margaret kept her focus on the men outside, watching as they reached the SUV and climbed inside. The engine started, headlights flaring to life. For a moment she thought they might try something reckless, ram the house perhaps, but the vehicle slowly turned around and headed down the long driveway toward the main road. Only when the taillights had disappeared from view did Margaret allow herself a moment to breathe. The immediate danger had passed, but she knew this wasn't over. Men like these didn't give up after one failed attempt, especially when money was involved. And somewhere, a property developer was waiting to hear about an old widow who had been frightened into selling her farm. They would be back, perhaps not these same men, but others. And next time, they would come better prepared, knowing what and who they were facing. Margaret turned to her captives. First things first, secure the survivors, tend to their wounds as humanely as her training allowed, and then make that call on the satellite phone. James had prepared for this eventuality, had known the land would be targeted after he was gone. The phone number he had programmed was her lifeline now. As she bound Mitch's leg with a tourniquet, her thoughts turned to Rex, lying somewhere outside in the darkness. Her faithful companion deserved a proper burial when this was over, and the men responsible deserved whatever justice was coming for them. "Who are you?" Mitch whispered, his voice weak from pain and blood loss. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Just a widow defending her home," she replied, then added more quietly, "But I wasn't always just a widow." She secured the tourniquet, then rose to check. On Decker, the night was far from over, and decisions would need to be made about what happened next. But one thing was certain. Margaret Voss had no intention of leaving the land that she and James had called home, and anyone who tried to take it from her would soon discover exactly why that was a grave mistake. Margaret finished securing Decker to one of her kitchen chairs with zip ties from James's workshop. The man had passed out from shock and blood, loss, but his breathing was steady. She'd cleaned and bandaged his wound as best she could. The shotgun blast had torn through muscle but missed major arteries. He would survive until help arrived. Mitch remained conscious but subdued, his injured leg properly tourniqueted and also secured to a chair. The fight had gone out of him once he realized who he was dealing with. "You weren't in the file," he muttered, watching her move efficiently around the kitchen. "Just a widow with valuable land, easy target, no military background mentioned." Margaret retrieved the satellite phone from her pocket. "Someone did sloppy research." "Who are you calling?" Mitch asked, eyeing the device. "Cops?" "No." Margaret stepped to the window, checking the driveway again to ensure the SUV hadn't returned. "Not yet." She pressed the single button on the phone. It rang only once before connecting. "Authentication code," demanded a clipped professional voice. Margaret took a deep breath. "Sierra Tango 5973, Collins, Margaret, Staff Sergeant, retired." A pause. "Stand by for verification." Margaret waited, her mind flashing to the last time she'd spoken with this particular organization. James's funeral. They had approached her afterward, offered her a position as a training consultant. She had declined. Her fighting days were over, she'd told them. She wanted peace. "Authentication confirmed," the voice returned. "Situation? Home invasion. 5 armed individuals, 2 contained, 3 retreated. Property-related motivation, farmland developers. Casualties." Margaret's throat tightened. "1, my dog. Human casualties, negative. 2 wounded, non-critical. Another." He paused. "Requesting intervention." Margaret looked at her captives. Local law enforcement was 20 minutes away at best, understaffed and potentially compromised if the developers had influence in the county. And this was only the beginning. If she turned these men over to the police, there would be paperwork, investigations, possibly charges against her for excessive force. Meanwhile, whoever had sent them would regroup, reassess, and try again with better intelligence. Yes, she decided, full protocol. Understood, assets en route, estimated arrival 30 minutes. Secure location and remain on premises. The call ended. Margaret pocketed the phone and returned her attention to her captives. "What did you just do?" Mitch asked, his voice revealing the first hint of genuine fear she'd heard from him. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she asked, "Who hired you?" "I told you, above my pay grade." But his eyes darted nervously to the floor. Was it Blackwell Estates, Morrison Development, or someone local? Councilman Reeves, perhaps? She had suspected Reeves of taking kickbacks from developers for years. Mitch remained silent. "Let me explain your situation," Margaret said, pulling up a chair to sit across from him. "In approximately 25 minutes, some people are going to arrive. They're not the police. They're not bound by Miranda rights or due process. They're former colleagues of mine, and they specialize in cleaning up messes like this." She gestured to the blood-spattered living room. "They'll take you and your friend somewhere quiet to ask questions. You'll answer those questions eventually. Everyone does. The only variable is how unpleasant the process becomes." Mitch swallowed hard. "You're bluffing. You're just some old lady with military training." "My husband and I weren't just soldiers," Margaret said quietly. "After active duty, we worked for an organization that doesn't officially exist. When James got sick, we retired to this farm, but the organization takes care of its own, always." She stood and moved to the pantry where she had secured Jake earlier. Opening the door, she found the young man huddled exactly where she had left him, knees drawn to his chest. "Come with me," she ordered. Jake followed her back to the kitchen, his eyes widening at the sight of his wounded companions. "Oh, God!" he whispered. "Are they? They'll live," Margaret interrupted. "Sit." He obeyed, sinking into a chair across from Mitch, who glared at him with undisguised contempt. "Jake," Margaret said, "you have a choice to make. Cooperate now. Tell me who hired you and why, and you walk away from this. Or wait for my colleagues to arrive and take your chances with them." Jake looked from Margaret to Mitch and back again. The youth's hands trembled. "He'll kill me if I talk," Jake said. "Who will?" Margaret pressed. "Your employer?" Jake nodded mutely. "I can't protect you from him if I don't know who he is," Margaret pointed out. The kitchen fell silent, except for Decca's labored breathing. Outside, clouds had rolled in, obscuring the moon. The darkness beyond the window seemed to press against the glass, as if the night itself was listening. Finally, Jake spoke. It was Chambers, Victor Chambers. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Victor Chambers was not a property developer. He was the CEO of Nexus Agricultural Technologies, an agribusiness giant that had been buying up farmland across 3 counties. The company specialized in genetically modified crops and had a reputation for aggressive expansion and questionable ethics. "Why does Chambers want my land?" Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. Jake glanced nervously at Mitch, who was shooting daggers at him with his eyes. "The water rights," Jake said. "Your property controls access to the river bend that feeds the entire valley. Nat's building a processing plant 5 miles downstream. They need to control the water flow. All the surrounding properties have sold except yours." Margaret nodded slowly. It made sense. Her land included nearly a mile of riverfront. James had often spoken about the importance of protecting the watershed, keeping it free from industrial contamination. He would never have sold to a company like Nexus. "And Chambers sent you to what? Frighten me into selling? Kill me if I refuse." Just to scare you, Jake insisted. Make you realize it wasn't safe to stay. The property offer would come tomorrow. After you'd had a bad night, that was the plan. But then Harlan shot your dog, and everything went sideways. Mitch made a disgusted sound. Shut your mouth, kid. You're dead anyway once Chambers finds out you talked. He doesn't have to find out, Margaret said, an idea forming. Not if we handle this correctly. She walked to the window again, checking. The time, 15 minutes until her former colleagues arrived. Enough time to formulate a strategy. Here's what's going to happen, she announced, turning back to her captives. My associates will take you both for medical treatment and debriefing. Jake, you'll tell them everything you've told me. Mitch, you'll corroborate his story if you know what's good for you. And then what? Mitch asked bitterly. Your shadow government friends disappear from us? That depends on how useful you make yourselves, Margaret replied. But I suspect you'll be released once this situation is resolved. The organization doesn't waste resources on small-time muscles unless necessary. She picked up her shotgun again and checked the ammunition. Meanwhile, I have a proposition for Victor Chambers. The black SUV traveled swiftly along the empty country road, headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, Harlan gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, while Cruz repeatedly tried to reach their teammates on the radio. Nothing, Cruz said, throwing the device onto the dashboard in frustration. That crazy bitch has them. We need to call Chambers, Harlan muttered. And tell him what? That we got our asses handed to us by some old lady? That Mitch and Decker are captured and Jake is probably dead? He'll have us killed. Harlan turned onto the main highway, pushing the accelerator harder. We don't have a choice. He needs to know the situation has changed. That woman isn't just some widow. She's trained, military or worse. Cruz pulled out his phone, then hesitated. Maybe we should go back. With both of us, we might be able to... Did you not see what happened? She took down Mitch. Mitch, the guy was force recon before he went private. If she handled him, we wouldn't stand a chance. Cruz fell silent, weighing their limited options. Finally, he dialed a number. A cultured voice answered on the third ring. Report. Sir, we have a situation, Cruz began. The Voss property. There were complications. Explain. The single word carried the weight of a death sentence if the explanation proved unsatisfactory. Cruz swallowed hard. The widow was prepared. She's not what the intelligence suggested. She's got training, military or intelligence background. She neutralized Mitch and Decker. We had to retreat. A long silence followed, during which Cruz could almost hear the calculations happening on the other end of the line. Where are you now? Chambers finally asked. Highway 16 heading back to the rendezvous point. No, go to the secondary location, the warehouse. I'll meet you there in 2 hours. The call ended abruptly. Cruz looked at Harlan, whose face had gone pale. The warehouse, Harlan repeated. That's not good. The warehouse was where problems disappeared, usually problems of the human variety. If Chambers was meeting them there personally, it meant one of two things. Either he had a new plan that required direct oversight, or he intended to eliminate the witnesses to this failure. Cruz suspected the latter. Victor Chambers set his phone down carefully on his mahogany desk. At 57, he had built Nexus Agricultural Technologies from a small research lab into a multinational corporation with billions in annual revenue. He hadn't achieved this by accepting failure or leaving loose ends. The Voss property was the final piece in a complex acquisition strategy. Without it, the new processing plant would face significant regulatory hurdles regarding water access. With it, Nat would control the entire watershed, giving them de facto power over agricultural production throughout the region. He had expected the night's operation to be straightforward. The intelligence on Margaret Voss had painted her as a vulnerable widow in her 60s, living alone with a dog, emotionally attached to the property, but ultimately defenseless. The plan had been to frighten her, demonstrate her vulnerability, then present a generous offer that would seem like salvation rather than capitulation. Clearly, the intelligence had been flawed. Chambers pressed the intercom on his desk. "Send, in Kieran." Moments later, a tall woman with short grey hair entered the office. Dressed in a tailored suit that did little to disguise her athletic build, Kieran Frost had been Chambers' head of security for 8 years. Before that, she had worked for various private military contractors overseas. She was expensive, discreet, and utterly ruthless. "We have a situation with the Voss acquisition," Chambers said without preamble. Kieran remained standing, her posture military straight. "I've just received preliminary reports. The team encountered unexpected resistance." "The widow has a background we weren't aware of," Chambers confirmed. "Military or intelligence training. She captured 2 of our contractors and forced the others to retreat." Kieran's expression didn't change, but a slight narrowing of her eyes indicated surprise. "Our intelligence was thorough. There was nothing in her background check to suggest combat training." "Then someone erased her history," Chambers concluded. "The question is, who? And why is a trained operative living as a farmer's widow in rural Pennsylvania?" "I'll begin a deeper investigation immediately," Kieran promised. "What about the captured contractors?" Chambers waved a dismissive hand. "Low-level assets hired through intermediaries, nothing that can be traced directly to us. However, if local authorities become involved, it could complicate matters. And the property? We still need it." Chambers rose from his desk and moved to the wall of windows overlooking the Philadelphia skyline. "The processing plant represents a $300 million investment. Without water rights from the Voss property, we'll face regulatory obstacles that could delay operations by years. Do you want me to handle it personally?" Kieran asked. Chambers considered this. Kieran was his most valuable security asset, typically reserved for high-level corporate espionage and counterintelligence. Using her for a property acquisition was overkill, but if the widow truly had a background in covert operations, perhaps it was justified. "Not yet," he decided. "I'm meeting the remaining contractors at the warehouse. I want to hear their first-hand account of what happened. Then I'll determine our next course of action." "Understood." Kieran turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Sir, if the widow does have intelligence connections, this could escalate beyond a simple property dispute." "I'm aware," Chambers replied coldly. "That's why failure is not an option. One way or another, that land will belong to Nexus by the end of the week." After Kieran departed, Chambers returned to his desk and opened a secure drawer. Inside lay a slim file labeled Operation Watershed. He reviewed the contents one more time, paying particular attention to the contingency plans. If intimidation had failed, there were other methods available: legal pressure, environmental violations fabricated against the property, or more permanent solutions if necessary. Victor Chambers hadn't built his empire by accepting defeat, and he certainly wouldn't let one stubborn widow stand in the way of the company's expansion, regardless of her mysterious background. Back at the farmhouse, 2 unmarked black SUVs pulled into Margaret's driveway precisely 30 minutes after her call. 6 individuals emerged, 4 men and 2 women, all dressed in nondescript civilian clothing that nonetheless failed to conceal their military bearing. Margaret met them at the door, shotgun still in hand. The leader, a lean man with salt and pepper hair, whom she recognized as Daniel Weber, nodded to her with professional respect. "Staff Sergeant Collins," he said, using her former name and rank. "Been a while." 8 years, 2 months, Margaret replied. "James's funeral," Weber nodded. "I remember. You turned down our job offer. I wanted peace. How's that working out for you?" His gaze moved past her to the blood-spattered living room and the 2 bound men in the kitchen. Margaret didn't bother responding to the sardonic question. Two captives, one unconscious with a shotgun wound to the shoulder. The other has a leg injury, a tourniquet applied approximately 40 minutes ago. Weber gestured, and 4 of his team moved past her to secure the prisoners. They worked with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs and preparing the wounded men for transport. The younger one, Jake, is cooperative, Margaret continued. He's identified their employer as Victor Chambers, CEO of Nexus Agricultural Technologies. Weber raised an eyebrow. The Agritech Corporation. Interesting. Any idea why he wants your farm? Water rights for a processing plant. My property controls river access for the valley. Makes sense. Weber looked around the house, his experienced eye taking in the signs of the conflict. Any chance this was just overzealous contractors acting without explicit orders to use violence? Margaret shook her head. 5 armed men doesn't sound like a misunderstanding. They killed my dog as a message. Weber's expression hardened slightly at that detail. He had known how much Rex meant to her. The dog had been a gift from the organization after James's diagnosis, trained as both a companion and a guard. What do you want us to do with them? He asked, nodding toward the captives being loaded onto stretchers. We can make them disappear, if that's your preference. Margaret considered this. Part of her, the cold, tactical part that had served her well in combat, wanted exactly that. Clean, simple, final. But another part, the part James had nurtured during their years of peaceful farming, resisted the easy solution. No, she decided. They're just hired muscles. I want Chambers, and for that I need them alive and talking. Weber nodded, unsurprised. We'll take them to the facility in Maryland. Extract everything they know about Chambers' operation, his security, his methods. And then it depends what we find. If Chambers is operating within normal corporate parameters, just using aggressive tactics for acquisition, we'll keep the contractors on ice until the situation is resolved, then release them with appropriate memory modifications and cover stories. And if he's into something deeper, Margaret asked. Weber's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then we'll have a conversation with Mr. Chambers about the national security implications of his business practices. The team had finished securing the prisoners. One of Weber's colleagues approached, a tall woman with a severe bun whom Margaret recognized as Dr. Abernathy, the organization's medical specialist. Both subjects stabilized for transport, she reported. The shoulder wound will require surgery, but is non-life-threatening. The leg injury is serious but controlled. We need to move within the hour to maintain the tourniquet timeline. Weber nodded. Prepare for immediate departure. He turned back to Margaret. What's your plan now? I'm staying here, she said firmly. This is my home. I'll deal with Chambers if he shows up. Alone? After what just happened? I'm not leaving, Margaret insisted. James and I built this place. Every nail, every board, every garden bed. I won't be driven out. Weber studied her for a long moment, then sighed. You always were stubborn, Collins. But you don't have to face this alone. He gestured to the remaining 2 members of his team, a younger man with watchful eyes and a woman whose relaxed posture belied her alertness. Hawkins and Chen will stay with you. They're our best surveillance and counter-surveillance specialists. If Chambers or his people return, you'll have backup. Margaret started to protest, but Weber cut her off. Non-negotiable. The organization protects its own, even the retired ones. James would haunt me personally if I left you undefended. The mention of James silenced her objection. He was right. James would have insisted on protection. Her husband had always been pragmatic about security measures. Fine, she conceded, but they follow my lead. This is my property and my fight. Agreed, Weber said. But remember, this isn't a battlefield in some foreign country. This is American soil. There are legal considerations. Tell that to the Moor men who killed my dog, Margaret replied grimly. Weber's expression softened slightly. "I am sorry about Rex. He was a good dog." Margaret nodded, the grief she had been suppressing threatening to surface. She pushed it back down. There would be time for mourning later. "We'll maintain secure communications," Weber continued. "All business again. I'll report what we learn from the prisoners. Meanwhile, maintain normal patterns. If Chambers is monitoring the property, we don't want to alert him that you have reinforcements." With that, Weber rejoined his team. The wounded prisoners were loaded into one of the SUVs, while Weber and Dr. Abernathy took the second vehicle. Within minutes, they had disappeared down the driveway, leaving Margaret alone with the two specialists. Hawkins, the young man, immediately began a sweep of the property, checking for surveillance devices or other security breaches. Chen, the woman, set up a communications array in the spare bedroom that would allow them to monitor all approaches to the farm. Margaret watched them work, with a mixture of appreciation and melancholy. Their efficiency reminded her of her own days in the service. The muscle memory had returned during the confrontation, but she felt the weight of the years now. At 62, she wasn't the soldier she had once been, but she was still a fighter, and Victor Chambers was about to discover exactly what that meant. Dawn broke over the Voss farmhouse, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and gold. Margaret stood on the back porch, coffee mug in hand, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the place where she had buried Rex just hours before. She'd insisted on doing it herself, rejecting Hawkins' offer of help. The simple wooden marker she'd crafted bore only his name and the words, "Faithful until the end." The farmyard was eerily quiet without him. No enthusiastic barking to greet the morning. No paws padding alongside her as she walked the property boundaries, a ritual they'd shared every dawn since James passed. "The perimeter is secure," Chen said, approaching silently from behind. The surveillance specialist moved like a ghost, something Margaret might have appreciated under different circumstances. No signs of activity on the access road or neighboring properties. Margaret nodded without turning. And the satellite? Clear thermal imaging for a 5-mile radius. No vehicles or personnel approaching. "They'll be regrouping," Margaret said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Planning their next move." Chen leaned against the porch railing, her casual posture belying her alert eyes that constantly scanned the tree line. "Weber sent an update. The contractors are talking. Chambers runs a tight operation, but he's been cutting corners on regulatory compliance. The processing plant has already failed 2 environmental impact assessments. He needs your water rights to divert pollution downstream." Margaret's jaw tightened. "So it's not just about controlling the water flow. He wants to use my land to poison the valley, essentially." Chen tilted her head slightly, a gesture Margaret recognized as the woman receiving information through her earpiece. "Hawkins has completed the house sweep. No surveillance devices, but he found something interesting. In your barn." "What?" "Survey markers, high-end ones, recently placed. Someone's been mapping your property in detail." Margaret frowned. The barn had been locked, the security system active. "When?" "Within the last week, based on the electronics. They're transmitting real-time topographical data." A cold anger settled in Margaret's chest. The invasion had begun before last night, strangers walking her land, evaluating it not as a home, but as an asset to be acquired or an obstacle to be removed. "Show me," she said, setting down her coffee. The warehouse sat on the outskirts of an industrial park, surrounded by defunct manufacturing facilities that had closed decades ago when production moved overseas. Its rusted exterior and broken windows suggested abandonment, but the interior told a different story. Renovated with modern security systems and soundproofed rooms where Nexus Agricultural Technologies handled its more delicate business matters. Victor Chambers stepped from his luxury SUV, nodding to the security personnel who materialized from the shadows to escort him inside. He'd changed from his business suit into more practical attire, dark slacks and a tactical sweater that allowed freedom of movement. At his hip, visible beneath his open jacket, was a holstered Glock 19. Chambers was a firm believer in personal preparedness. Inside, Harlan and Cruz waited in what had once been a foreman's office, now converted into a secure meeting room. Both men stood as Chambers entered, their postures stiff with barely concealed fear. "Sit," Chambers commanded, taking his own seat at the head of the table. Kieran entered behind him, closing the door. She remained standing, a silent presence, against the wall. "Walk me through what happened," Chambers said, his voice deceptively calm. "Every detail." Harlan cleared his throat nervously. "We approached as planned. The property was dark, single occupant as expected. We neutralized the dog first." "Why?" interrupted Chambers. "Sir, why kill the dog?" "The plan was intimidation, not elimination at that stage." Harlan shifted uncomfortably. "It was aggressive. Barking would have alerted the target. It was a 12-year-old Labrador retriever," Chambers said flatly. "Hardly a tactical threat." "I made a judgment call," Harlan replied defensively, "to maintain the element of surprise." "Continue." Harlan described the infiltration of the house, the search for Margaret, and then the unexpected ambush. As he recounted how the widow had systematically taken down their team, Chambers' expression remained impassive, but his fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the table surface, a tell that Kieran recognized as suppressed anger. "She knew what she was doing," Cruz added when Harlan finished. "Military training, definitely. Maybe special forces or intelligence. She moved like a professional. And she had help," Harlan said. "After we retreated, we monitored the property from a distance. 2 unmarked black SUVs arrived. 6 individuals, tactical movement patterns, civilian clothes but military bearing. They took Mitch and Decker away." This information caused Chambers to look sharply at Kieran, who stepped forward. "Government involvement?" Chambers asked her. "Possible, but unusual," Kieran replied. "Regular military wouldn't respond to a civilian incident this way, more likely private security or a contracting firm. Either way, this has escalated beyond a simple property acquisition," Chambers concluded. He fixed his gaze on the 2 contractors. "Your team was specifically selected because you had the skills to handle unexpected resistance without leaving evidence. Yet here we are." Harlan swallowed visibly. "Sir, with respect, the intelligence was flawed. We were told she was a harmless widow. No one mentioned combat training or outside connections." "A fair point," Chambers conceded after a moment. "The failure of intelligence falls on my organization." He glanced at Kieran, who accepted the implied criticism with a slight nod. "What happens now?" Cruz asked cautiously. Chambers considered the question. The Voss property remained essential to his plans. The processing plant represented not just a significant financial investment, but a strategic foothold in agricultural production for the entire region. Without it, competitors would gain an advantage that could take years to overcome. At the same time, the situation had grown more complicated. If Margaret Voss truly had connections to government agencies or private security organizations, direct confrontation carried increased risks. "We adapt," Chambers decided. "The frontal approach failed. We'll pivot to alternative methods." He turned to Kieran. "Contact our friends at the county assessor's office. I want every possible code violation on that property documented by close. Of business today, tax audits, environmental inspections, historical preservation reviews, the works. Bureaucratic warfare." Kieran nodded. "Already initiated as a contingency. First inspectors will arrive this morning." "Good!" Chambers turned back to the contractors. "You 2 are being reassigned. Take the corporate jet to our Montana facility. Head of security, they will have your new assignments." Relief washed over their faces, quickly replaced by suspicion at the unexpected reprieve. "That's it?" Harlan asked cautiously. "We're not being terminated? Contrary to dramatic fiction, Mr. Harlan, I don't execute employees for following orders with incomplete intelligence, Chambers replied dryly. However, I do expect absolute discretion regarding last night's events. The reassignment includes a substantial bonus contingent upon your silence. Both men nodded eagerly. Report to the airfield immediately. Kieran's team will handle your transportation. After they departed, escorted by 2 security personnel, Chambers turned to Kieran. They'll talk eventually, she observed. Of course. They will, Chambers agreed. But by then, it won't matter. The Montana assignment is legitimate. We need security personnel there, but the facility is remote enough to keep them contained until this situation resolves. Kieran moved to the chair recently vacated by Harlan. And if the bureaucratic approach fails, it won't, Chambers said confidently. Everyone has vulnerabilities. If legal pressure doesn't work, financial strain might. If that fails, there's always the emotional approach. The widow has already lost her husband and her dog, Kieran pointed out. What emotional leverage remains? Chambers smiled thinly. That's what I need you to find out. Everyone has connections, people they care about, friends, family, community ties. Identify them all. Map her entire social network. He stood, straightening his jacket. Meanwhile, I have a board meeting at 10. The directors are expecting an update on the processing plant timeline. I'll inform them of minor regulatory delays, but assure them the project remains on schedule. Is that accurate? Kieran asked. It will be, Chambers replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. One way or another, that property will be ours by the end of the week. Margaret examined the survey marker Hawkins had discovered hidden beneath a stack of hay bales in the barn's back corner. The device was sophisticated, a black cylinder about the size of a soda can with multiple sensors and a small satellite uplink. Military grade, Hawkins explained, crouching beside her. Measures soil composition, water table depth, geological stability. Far more advanced than standard surveying equipment. Can we trace the transmission? Margaret asked. Hawkins shook his head. Encrypted and bounced through multiple satellites. But we can use it to our advantage. He produced a small device from his pocket. This will let us monitor who's monitoring you. If they check the data feed, we'll know. And this was placed within the last week? Margaret's mind raced through recent visitors to the property. There hadn't been many. The mail carrier, a feed delivery for her chickens, the elderly neighbor who occasionally brought over preserves. Based on battery levels and transmission logs, I'd say 4 days ago. 4 days ago. Margaret mentally reviewed her calendar. The only visitor had been the county water inspector, she realized aloud. Claimed there was a routine check of wells in the area due to contamination concerns downstream. Spent nearly 2 hours walking the property, supposedly taking water samples. Perfect cover for placing surveillance, Chen commented, standing. Guard at the barn entrance, Margaret's expression hardened. If Chambers had corrupted local officials, this fight would be more difficult than anticipated. The farm had been her sanctuary, the place she had chosen to leave behind the world of covert operations and violence. Now that world had followed. Her home. Hawkins, what other survey markers are on my property? She asked. The young operative pulled out a tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen. Based on transmission patterns, I count 7 in total. 3 along the riverfront, 2 near property boundaries, 1 by the well, and this one in the barn. Can we feed them false data? A slow smile spread across Hawkins' face. Now you're thinking tactically, ma'am. Yes, we can. What did you have in mind? Before Margaret could answer, Chen raised a hand for silence, her head tilted in that distinctive listening pose. Vehicle approaching, county markings, Environmental Protection Department. Margaret exchanged glances with her companions. Right on schedule. The bureaucratic assault begins. Hawkins quickly concealed the survey marker back under the hay. How do you want to play this? Margaret considered her options. Direct confrontation would only escalate the situation. Running interference with local officials would burn political capital she might need later. A more subtle approach was required. We go with the script, she decided. Harmless widow, confused by all the attention. Let's see what they're after and how far they're willing to go. Chen nodded approvingly. Keep them underestimating you. Smart. Margaret brushed hay from her jeans and straightened her flannel shirt. I've had practice playing roles. This one's simpler than most. To Hawkins, she added, stay out of sight, but within earshot. Record everything. She stepped out of the barn just as a white county vehicle pulled up to the farmhouse. A man in a khaki uniform emerged, carrying a clipboard and what appeared to be sampling equipment. He was in his 40s, balding, with the weary expression of a career civil servant. Margaret put on her best, confused, elderly woman expression and approached him. Can I help you, young man? The inspector straightened, clearly caught off guard by her sudden appearance. Mrs. Voss, I'm Harold Benson from the County Environmental Protection Department. We've received reports of possible contamination on your property. Contamination, Margaret echoed, injecting concern into her voice. What kind of contamination? Benson consulted his clipboard. Agricultural runoff, possibly toxic. We need to take soil samples, particularly near the river boundary. The river boundary, exactly where 3 of the survey markers had been placed. This was no coincidence. Well, that's concerning, Margaret said, wringing her hands for effect. My late husband and I have always been careful with our farming practices. Organic methods only, no chemicals. Nevertheless, we need to inspect. It's standard procedure. Benson's tone suggested he'd rehearsed this explanation. May I have your permission to access the property? Margaret hesitated, playing the role of a flustered widow. I suppose so, if it's official business, but I'd like to accompany you if that's all right. I know the property better than anyone. Benson frowned slightly. That won't be necessary, ma'am. I have detailed maps. I insist, Margaret said, her tone firming just enough to suggest she wouldn't be deterred. My husband always said never to let strangers wander the property alone. Too many liability issues these days. The inspector looked like he wanted to object but thought better of it. Fine, but please don't interfere with the sampling process. Wouldn't dream of it, Margaret assured him with a grandmotherly smile. Let me just get my walking shoes. As they walked toward the river, Margaret kept up a steady stream of inane chatter about the property's history, her husband's farming techniques, and her concerns about the changing weather patterns, all while carefully observing Benson's reactions and methods. The inspector made a show of collecting soil samples at regular intervals, documenting each location with photographs. But Margaret noticed he seemed particularly interested in areas near the property boundaries and water access points, precisely where the survey markers had been placed. Finding anything concerning? She asked innocently after the 3rd sample. 2. Early to tell, Benson replied, not meeting her eyes. Lab will have results in a few days. And what happens if you do find contamination? Benson straightened, adjusting his county cap. Depends on the severity. Could be anything from remediation requirements to use restrictions. In extreme cases, the county can condemn portions of the property. There it was, the threat, thinly, veiled in bureaucratic language. Chambers was laying groundwork for legal seizure if intimidation failed. That sounds serious, Margaret said, allowing a tremor to enter her voice. This land is all I have left of my James. I couldn't bear to lose any of it. Benson had the grace to look uncomfortable. It's just a procedure, ma'am. I'm sure everything will be fine. 2 hours later, after Benson had collected samples from a dozen locations, all conveniently near strategic points on the property, he packed his equipment and prepared to leave. When will I hear about the results? Margaret asked, still playing. Her role: "We'll send official notification by mail," Benson replied. "Should be within 10 business days." Margaret knew that timeline was fiction. Chambers would have the information by nightfall, and whatever plan he was constructing would advance accordingly. "I hope this all gets sorted out quickly," she said, adding a deliberate quiver to her lip. "All this stress isn't good for a woman." "My age." Benson nodded awkwardly and retreated to his vehicle. Margaret maintained her vulnerable facade until the county truck disappeared down her driveway. Only then did she allow her expression to harden. Chen and Hawkins emerged from their surveillance positions. "Got everything on record," Hawkins confirmed. "Audio and video, classic intimidation through bureaucratic channels." "He only took samples from locations corresponding to the survey markers," Chen added. "Not a legitimate environmental assessment by any standard." Margaret nodded grimly. "Chambers is building a paper trail. He'll fabricate evidence of contamination, use it to justify legal action against the property." "Standard corporate land grab tactics," Hawkins agreed. "We've seen it before." Margaret gazed toward the river that bordered her property, its waters glinting in the morning sunlight. James had loved this land and had envisioned passing it down through generations. The thought of it being corrupted by Nexus agricultural technologies, turned into a mechanism for pollution rather than sustenance, was intolerable. "We need to accelerate our timeline," she decided. "Chambers is moving faster than anticipated." Chen raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" "Defense is no longer sufficient," Margaret said, her military training asserting itself. "We need to take the fight to him." "Weber's team is still extracting information from the contractors," Hawkins reminded her. "We don't have a complete picture of Chambers' organization yet." "We have enough," Margaret countered. "And more importantly, we know his weakness." "Which is?" Chen asked. Margaret's expression was cold determination personified. "Time. His board is expecting the processing plant to proceed on schedule. He's promised them my land by the end of the week. That's our leverage." She turned back toward the farmhouse, her mind already formulating a strategy. "I think it's time Margaret Voss came out of retirement for one last mission." Behind her, Chen and Hawkins exchanged glances. They recognized the look on her face. It was the expression of a seasoned operative who had moved beyond defensive tactics and was now planning the offensive. Whatever Victor Chambers thought he knew about the widow whose dog he had killed, he was about to learn how monumentally he had underestimated his opponent. Victor Chambers had built his career on calculating risk and seizing advantage. Even in the most challenging negotiations, he maintained control through preparation and psychological dominance. But as he stared across the conference table at Margaret Voss, he recognized he had severely miscalculated his opponent. "I need a moment to confer with my colleagues," he said finally, his voice betraying none of the turmoil in his thoughts. Margaret nodded. "Of course. We'll step outside." After Margaret and her associates left the room, Chambers turned to Kieran. "And Blackwell, how the hell did she get those design plans?" he demanded, his composure slipping. "Those were secured on our internal servers." Kieran's expression was grim. "Either we have a security breach or her connections are far more extensive than we anticipated. Either way, it confirms she has serious backing. The EPA angle is concerning," Blackwell added. "If they launch a full investigation, construction delays would be inevitable. Investor confidence would plummet." Chambers tapped his fingers rapidly. "On the polished table surface. Options? We could call her bluff," Kieran suggested. "Even with those documents, building a case would take time. We could accelerate the processing plant construction, establish operations before regulatory barriers become insurmountable." Blackwell shook his head. "Too risky. If the EPA is already involved, forcing the timeline could trigger injunctions, not to mention potential criminal liability for knowingly proceeding with non-compliant designs." "What about our board?" Chambers asked. "How do we explain this development?" Position it as a minor setback, Kieran advised. Tell them we're exploring alternative property options that don't impact the overall project timeline. Chambers considered this. The processing plant represented a cornerstone of Nexus's 5-year growth strategy. The board had approved the project based on specific profit projections that depended on the low-cost waste disposal methods encoded in those designs. Alternative approaches would slash margin forecasts by at least 30%. Retreat isn't an option, he decided. There must be another pressure point we haven't exploited. Kieran hesitated, then said, "There is one avenue we haven't explored. The widow's husband." "He's dead," Chambers pointed out flatly. "Yes, but his legacy isn't. Our background investigation shows James Voss was buried at Riverside Cemetery on a family plot that's been maintained for generations. The widow visits weekly without fail." Understanding dawned in Chambers' eyes. "Emotional leverage," Kieran nodded. "Precisely. If direct acquisition fails, we could pursue condemnation of the cemetery land for infrastructure development. The threat alone might be sufficient." Blackwell looked uncomfortable. Threatening a cemetery crosses ethical boundaries that could generate significant blowback if made public. "Which is why it would be handled with absolute discretion," Kieran countered. "Simply making her aware of our influence over the cemetery board would create the necessary pressure." Chambers weighed the approach. It was undeniably ruthless, even by his standards, but with investor expectations and his own reputation at stake, perhaps ruthless was warranted. "Hold that option in reserve," he instructed. "First, let's probe for weaknesses in her position. The presence of Hargrove suggests institutional support, but we don't know its extent or limitations." He straightened his tie and pressed the button to summon the hotel staff. "Please ask Mrs. Voss and her associates to return." When Margaret's group re-entered, Chambers had regained his composure. He smiled pleasantly, as if they were discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. "Mrs. Voss, I appreciate your candor," he began. "It seems we've both underestimated each other's resources and determination." Margaret offered a thin smile in return. "A common error in asymmetric conflicts, Mr. Chambers." "Indeed." Chambers leaned forward slightly. "While I find your counteroffer interesting, I'm afraid it doesn't address Nexus's fundamental business needs. Our processing facility requires specific geographical parameters that your property uniquely provides." "My sympathies," Margaret replied without a trace of sincerity. "Perhaps you should have considered that before attempting intimidation tactics." Chambers spread his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "Ancient history. Let's focus on the future. Perhaps there's a compromise position. Nexus could lease a portion of your property, the section bordering the river, while you retain ownership and residential rights to the remainder." Margaret exchanged glances with Hargrove, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "That arrangement would still enable your non-compliant waste disposal methods," she pointed out. "The environmental impact would be identical, just with my tacit cooperation, which would be generously compensated," Chambers countered. "Say, triple the market leasing rate plus annual renewal bonuses." Margaret's expression remained unmoved. "Mr. Chambers, let me be clear. Under no circumstances will I allow my land to become a channel for industrial pollution, not for any price." The finality in her tone tested Chambers' patience. He maintained his cordial demeanor, but his eyes hardened. "Principles are admirable, Mrs. Voss, but they can be expensive to maintain, particularly when they impact others." "Is that a threat?" Margaret asked quietly. "An observation," Chambers corrected. "Your stance affects more than just yourself. The processing plant would bring hundreds of jobs to a region suffering from economic decline. Your neighbors, the community you claim to care about, would benefit significantly from this development." He paused, then added with calculated precision, "Even sacred spaces depend on community prosperity." I understand Riverside Cemetery, where your husband rests, has struggled financially in recent years. Its board of directors is considering significant changes to their land use policies. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Margaret's expression didn't change, but Chen shifted slightly beside her, a protective move that didn't escape Kieran's notice. Fascinating, Margaret said after a moment. I didn't realize your research extended to my personal mourning habits. Thoroughness is a corporate value at Nexus, Chambers replied smoothly. We like to understand all aspects of complex situations. Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Then understand this. If you threaten my husband's resting place in any way, directly or through proxies, what follows won't be handled through legal channels or regulatory agencies. The quiet intensity of her words caused even Kieran to tense. The threat wasn't explicit, but its implications were crystal clear. Hargrove cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Perhaps we should take a brief recess. These discussions have ventured into territory that seems counterproductive to reaching an agreement. Agreed, Chambers said, grateful for the interruption. Margaret's reaction had confirmed his suspicion. The cemetery was indeed a vulnerability. But leveraging it carried risks he needed to evaluate carefully. Shall we reconvene in 30 minutes? He suggested. Margaret stood, gathering her materials. Actually, I believe we've covered all the necessary ground. My position remains unchanged. Nexus will cease all attempts to acquire my property and withdraw the fabricated regulatory complaints. In return, I won't escalate matters further. She placed a business card on the table. You have until noon tomorrow to communicate your acceptance. After that, the EPA receives my full report, including documentation of tonight's attempted coercion. Before Chambers could respond, Margaret and her associates departed, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence in the conference room. Kieran was the first to speak. That didn't go as planned. No, Chambers agreed grimly. But it was informative. We know her pressure points now. The cemetery threat rattled her despite her counter-threat, which should not be dismissed, Kieran cautioned. Her background suggests she's capable of significant retaliation if sufficiently provoked. Chambers picked up Margaret's business card, noting it displayed only her name and a phone number. No title, no affiliation, just like the woman herself, revealing only what was necessary. Prepare our contingency measures, he instructed. If we can't have the property, we'll ensure no one profits from it. The drive back to the farm was tense, with Margaret gazing silently out the window as Chen navigated the winding country roads. Former Senator Hargrove occupied the back seat, making notes on his tablet. You did well there, Hargrove commented finally. Chambers was visibly shaken by your revelations. He recovered quickly, Margaret observed. And he's not finished. The cemetery threat was a test balloon, gauging my reaction to determine if it's a viable pressure point. We can arrange security for the cemetery, Chen suggested. Surveillance, personnel, whatever you need. Margaret nodded absently, her thoughts elsewhere. James always said Chambers was dangerous because he thinks 10 moves ahead. He's already planning his next approach. Which is why we have contingencies of our own, Hargrove reminded her. Webber's team is prepared to execute on your signal. Margaret turned from the window. I appreciate your participation today, Senator. Your presence lent credibility to our position. Hargrove smiled. James was a good friend. When Webber explained the situation, there was no question I would help. Besides, I've had my eye on Nexus Agricultural Technologies for years. Their lobbying activities have undermined environmental regulations across multiple states. Will your firm continue to provide cover if this escalates? Margaret asked. Absolutely. Blackwood Consulting stands ready to serve as your public face in this matter. As far as anyone knows, you're simply our client, a widow defending her property with professional assistance. As they turned onto the long driveway leading to the farmhouse, Margaret spotted an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the barn, a mud-splattered pickup truck that had seen better days. Hawkins stood nearby, conversing with an elderly man in overalls. "Visitor?" Chen asked, immediately alert. "Looks like Earl Jenkins," Margaret replied, relaxing slightly. "My neighbor to the east, third-generation farmer, salt-of-the-earth type." They parked beside the pickup, and Earl turned to greet them, his weathered face breaking into a smile beneath his ever-present John Deere cap. "Margaret," he called. "Been trying to reach you since yesterday. Got something you need to hear." After introductions, they gathered in the kitchen where Earl accepted a cup of coffee with gratitude. "County's been buzzing with rumors," he began without preamble. "Some corporations are buying up land for a factory or processing plant. Started getting concerned when I saw what happened to the Miller property down by the junction." "What happened?" Margaret prompted. Earl's expression darkened. "Place is ruined. They tore down the farmhouse, cleared the orchards. Then the construction just stopped. Land sitting abandoned now, all torn up. Heard the Millers got half what they were promised once the papers were signed." "Nexus Agricultural Technologies," Hargrove confirmed. "It's a pattern we've documented across multiple properties." Earl nodded grimly. "That's the name. Been approaching several farmers in the valley with offers. Too good to be true, if you ask me. Then last night I got a visit myself. Fella in an expensive suit, talking about regional development opportunities, and how my land was strategically positioned for their plans." Margaret exchanged glances with Chen. "They're expanding their acquisition targets." "That's not all," Earl continued. "He mentioned you specifically. Said your property was creating complications for the development timeline, but they expected resolution soon. Implied pretty strongly that neighbors who cooperated early would receive preferential terms. Divide and conquer, Hargrove commented. Classic corporate acquisition strategy. Turn community members against each other by creating a financial incentive for early cooperation. Earl set down his coffee cup firmly. "That's why I'm here. Been neighbors with you and James for 20 years. Whatever these corporate vultures are planning, I want no part of it. Several other families feel the same way." "How many?" Margaret asked. 7 farms so far, covering about 1,200 acres surrounding your property. We had an informal meeting at my place last night, formed what we're calling the Valley Preservation Alliance. Figured we stand stronger together than alone." Margaret felt a surge of unexpected emotion. In the 3 years since James's death, she had maintained cordial but distant relationships with her neighbors, focused on her private grief. The revelation that they had organized in solidarity with her came as a touching surprise. "That's significant," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But I don't want anyone else drawn into my fight with Nexus. These people play hardball." Earl chuckled, a dry sound like autumn leaves. "Margaret, we may be simple farmers, but we're not naive. My family didn't hold on to this land for 4 generations by being pushovers. We know what we're facing." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and spread it on the table. "We drafted this last night, a mutual assistance pact. None of us sells without unanimous consent from all members. Any pressure tactics against one farm will be met with collective response from all." Margaret scanned the document, noting the signatures of families she had known for decades. The Pattersons, the Gutierrez clan, Old Man Hoffman, the Young Sisters and others. Solid people who had worked the valley's soil through good seasons and bad, floods and droughts, boom markets and recessions. "This changes the equation," Hargrove observed, reviewing the document with professional interest. "Collectively, these properties create a buffer zone that would significantly complicate Nexus's development plans, regardless of whether they acquire your land." "Exactly," Earl confirmed. "Even if they strong-arm 1 or 2 of us, they can't get to everyone, not without creating a public relations nightmare that would attract regulatory attention." Chen, who had been monitoring communications on her tablet, looked up. Weber is forwarding updated intelligence. The Nexus board meeting concluded 30 minutes ago. Chambers reported unexpected regulatory complications with the processing plant location. Their stock is down 3% in after-hours trading. Margaret absorbed this information, sensing a shift in momentum. What had begun as a personal violation, armed men invading her home, killing her beloved companion, had evolved into something larger. A community standing against corporate predation, a watershed quite literally being defended by those who depended on it. "Thank you, Earl," she said sincerely. "Please convey my gratitude to the Alliance members. This means more than you know." After, Earl departed, promising to keep Margaret updated on any further corporate approaches. She stood on the porch, watching his pickup disappear down the driveway. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her fields, the same fields where James had taught her to recognize the rhythms of the natural world, so different from the tactical environments of her military career. "Your move, Chambers," she murmured, to the empty air. The game just got more complicated. In his private office at Nexus headquarters, Victor Chambers reviewed the latest satellite imagery of the Valley properties, now marked with red boundaries indicating the newly formed Alliance holdings. The collective acreage created a significant obstacle to his planned development corridor. "This complicates matters," he acknowledged, studying the map. "The widow has rallied community support faster than anticipated." Kieran stood by the window, her posture relaxed but her attention fully engaged. "It changes our tactical approach, but not our strategic objective. The processing plant location remains optimal from both operational and financial perspectives." "Agreed." Chambers closed the satellite image and pulled up a personnel file. "What's the status of our assets within the county government?" Administrator Phillips remains cooperative. He's prepared to issue the usage restriction notice against the Voss property tomorrow as planned. However, he's expressed concerns about expanding similar actions against multiple properties simultaneously, fears it might trigger oversight from state authorities. Chambers dismissed this concern with a wave. Phillips will do as instructed if he wishes to maintain his lucrative consulting arrangement with our subsidiary. More importantly, where do we stand with the other approach? Kieran's expression remained professionally neutral. Preliminary work is underway. The cemetery board meets tonight to discuss the infrastructure modernization proposal our foundation has generously offered to fund. The chairman has been particularly receptive to the financial incentives. Good. Chambers steepled his fingers, contemplating his next move. The widow believes she's gained the upper hand with her community alliance and regulatory threats. Time to remind her that corporate resources can reach places she hasn't considered. He turned to his computer, pulling up a secure messaging application. "Contact our friends at Sentinel Security Solutions. I want a technical team deployed tonight. Full surveillance package on the Voss farmhouse and approaching roads." "And if they detect her security personnel?" Kieran asked. "They should avoid direct confrontation. This is intelligence gathering, not engagement." Chambers typed rapid instructions, then added, "Also, accelerate our contingency plan for property devaluation. If we can't have the Voss land, we'll ensure it becomes worthless. To her and anyone else." Kieran nodded, understanding the implication. Environmental sabotage is high risk. If discovered, the criminal liability would extend to corporate officers, which is why it will be handled with absolute deniability. Chambers completed his message and sent it with an encrypted signature. "Sometimes you have to sacrifice a pawn to capture a queen." As night fell across the valley, both sides prepared for the next phase of a conflict that had evolved far beyond a simple property dispute. For Margaret Voss, it remained deeply personal, a defense of home, legacy, and justice for a faithful companion taken too soon. For Victor Chambers, It had become a test of corporate power against individual resistance, with millions in profit and his professional reputation hanging in the balance. Neither was prepared to concede, and both understood that the coming days would determine not just the fate of one farm, but potentially the entire valley's future. Darkness had settled over the valley when Weber's secure call came through. Margaret answered immediately, setting the phone on speaker so Chen and Hawkins could hear. "We've intercepted communications from Chambers' security team," Weber reported without preamble. "They're mobilizing for nighttime operations near your property. Technical surveillance team, non-lethal equipment, expected deployment within the hour." Margaret exchanged glances with her companions. "Perimeter status?" "We've established sensor coverage on all access roads," Hawkins confirmed. "Any approach within a 2-mile radius will trigger alerts." "What about the cemetery?" Margaret asked, recalling Chambers' thinly veiled threat. "Already covered," Weber replied. 2 operatives positioned with observation equipment. No activity yet, but we're monitoring the board meeting scheduled for 9 p.m. Margaret checked her watch. 8:15. "Chambers moves quickly. We've barely left the negotiation table. He's feeling pressure," Chen observed. "Your community alliance changed the equation. He needs to regain leverage or risk losing board confidence." "Then we need to disrupt his timeline again," Margaret decided. She turned to Hawkins. "What's the status on the survey markers?" "Fully compromised," he reported with satisfaction. "We've reprogrammed all 7 to transmit falsified data. According to their readings, the soil composition and water table characteristics of your property now appear highly unsuitable for industrial development." "Will it hold up to scrutiny?" Margaret asked. Hawkins nodded. "The modifications are at the firmware level. They'd need physical access to the devices to detect the tampering." "Good. Next, I need to speak with Earl Jenkins. The Alliance needs to be prepared for what's coming." As Chen placed the call, Weber continued his report. "There's something else you should know. Our surveillance on Nexus contractors captured a supply requisition that raises concerns. Chemical compounds, delivery scheduled for tomorrow morning to a storage facility 10 miles from your property." "What kind of compounds?" Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Industrial contaminants, the type that, if introduced to groundwater, would render land unusable for agricultural purposes for years." Margaret's expression hardened. "Environmental sabotage. If he can't have my land, he'll poison it." "That would align with his established patterns," Weber agreed. 3 previous holdout properties experienced mysterious contamination incidents after refusing Nexus offers. Never proven, of course, but the timing was suspicious. "Can we intercept the shipment?" "That would constitute active interference with business operations," Weber cautioned, "beyond our current authorization parameters." Margaret understood the implication. The organization that had come to her aid operated within specific boundaries. Direct intervention against Nexus would cross legal lines they weren't prepared to traverse, at least not without plausible deniability. "Then we need to change our defensive posture," she decided. "Hawkins, establish continuous monitoring of all water access points on the property. If they can't buy the land or intimidate me off it, they'll try to render it worthless." "Already implementing surveillance drones with infrared capability," Hawkins confirmed. "We'll have eyes on every inch of the property perimeter." Chen returned from her call with Earl Jenkins. "The Alliance is mobilizing. They're establishing neighborhood watch patrols along all access roads to the valley. Any unfamiliar vehicles will be logged and questioned." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Rural communities know how to protect their own. That will complicate Chambers' surveillance operation." She walked to the window, gazing out at the darkened landscape of her farm. Somewhere out there, Chambers' people were preparing to encircle her property, gathering intelligence for their next move. The violation of her space, first by armed intruders, now by technological intrusion, intensified her resolve. "Reba," she said, "what do we know about the cemetery board meeting tonight? 7 members, 3 of whom have financial ties to Nexus subsidiaries. The agenda includes discussion of a modernization grant offered by the Nexus Community Foundation, ostensibly for infrastructure improvements, but the documentation suggests it would grant Nexus influence over land use decisions, including grave relocations." Margaret asked, her voice tight. Weber's hesitation conveyed the affirmative before he spoke it. "The proposal includes provisions for optimizing space utilization and consolidating memorial areas to improve visitor experience." The clinical language barely disguised the intent. James's resting place would be disturbed if this proposal passed. "When does the board vote?" "Tonight is a discussion only. Vote is scheduled for their regular meeting next week." Margaret checked her watch again. "That gives us time. Chen, contact Hargrove. We need Blackwood Consulting to prepare a legal injunction against any cemetery modifications. Cite historical preservation statutes and religious freedom protections." "On it," Chen replied, already typing on her tablet. "Now," Margaret continued, "let's address the immediate threat. Chambers has surveillance teams en route, and we can assume they'll attempt to place monitoring devices along the property boundary. Standard counter-surveillance protocols." Hawkins suggested. "No," Margaret decided after a moment's consideration. "Let them deploy their equipment." Both Chen and Hawkins looked surprised at this. "But modify your sensor grid to identify their device locations without alerting them to our detection," Margaret clarified. "Sometimes the best source of intelligence is your opponent's own surveillance." Hawkins smiled slowly, understanding dawning. "We let them watch us while we watch them watching. Then feed them exactly what we want them to see." "Precisely." Margaret returned to the table where satellite images of her property were spread out. "Chambers thinks he's dealing with a widow and her security consultants. Let's show him exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less." As her team began implementing the revised strategy, Margaret felt a familiar sensation settling over her, the focused clarity that had served her well during covert operations. The boundaries between her past and present lives were blurring. The peaceful retirement she and James had planned had been shattered, first by his illness, then by corporate greed. What remained was the core of who she had always been. A strategist, a protector, a force to be reckoned with when threatened. The Riverside Cemetery dates back to the Civil War, its older sections filled with weathered tombstones bearing the names of the valley's founding families. The newer areas, where James Voss had been laid to rest 3 years earlier, featured more modern memorials, set amid carefully maintained lawns and mature oak trees. The cemetery board met in a small stone building near the main entrance, a former groundskeeper's cottage, now serving as an administrative office. Inside, 7 board members, all local residents with family connections to the cemetery, gathered around a table too large for the space, forcing them to sit uncomfortably close together. Franklin Hayes, the board chairman and local bank manager, called the meeting to order precisely at 9 o'clock. His nervous demeanor suggested he understood the controversial nature of the night's main agenda item. "We'll dispense with regular business and move directly to the proposal from the Nexus Community Foundation," Hayes announced, distributing folders to each member. "As you can see, they're offering a substantial grant, $500,000, for infrastructure improvements throughout the cemetery." Murmurs rippled around the table as board members reviewed the documents. The amount was unprecedented. For the modestly funded cemetery, which typically operated on donations and minimal burial fees. "This seems extremely generous," observed Martha Winters, the board's longest-serving member. "What exactly does Nexus expect in return?" Hayes cleared his throat. "The Foundation has certain suggestions regarding optimization of our grounds. They've included a modernization plan developed by their landscape architects. He activated a projector, displaying a redesigned cemetery layout on the wall. The changes were significant, existing sections consolidated, pathways rerouted, and a large portion of the north section, where James Voss was buried, designated for what was labeled Memorial Garden Phase 2. This would require relocating existing graves, Martha stated flatly, her disapproval evident. The Foundation prefers the term respectful reinterment, Hayes replied, the corporate language sitting awkwardly in his mouth. They've assured us the process would be handled with the utmost dignity, all expenses covered by the grant. The oldest board member, Gerald Thompson, removed his glasses and cleaned them deliberately, a habit he employed when gathering his thoughts. In 40 years on this board, we've never relocated a single grave. Families choose specific resting places for their loved ones with the expectation of permanence. Times change, Gerald, countered Richard Bennett, the newest board member and coincidentally a contractor who had recently secured several Nexus development projects. Cemeteries across the country are modernizing. This grant would secure Riverside's financial future for decades. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with clear divisions emerging among the board. 3 members, including Bennett, strongly favored accepting the grant. 3 others, led by Martha and Gerald, expressed fundamental objections to the grave relocation provisions. Hayes, the chairman, remained non-committal, though his presentation of the proposal suggested favorable inclination. As the meeting neared conclusion, the administrative office door opened. A distinguished man in his 70s entered, accompanied by a younger woman carrying a leather portfolio. "I apologize for the interruption," the man said, his deep voice demanding immediate attention. "I'm William Hargrove, representing Blackwood Consulting. This is my associate, Ms. Chen." Hayes frowned at the intrusion. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hargrove, but this is a closed board meeting." "I understand," Hargrove replied smoothly, "which is why I'll be brief. My firm represents several families with loved ones interred at Riverside, including Margaret Voss, whose husband James rests in the section designated for relocation in your proposed plan." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. News traveled fast in small communities, but the cemetery proposal had been closely guarded. "We've prepared notification of intent to file for an emergency injunction should the board approve any grave relocation plan," Hargrove continued, as Chen distributed documents to each member. "Additionally, we've outlined potential personal liability issues board members may face if they approve actions that violate state cemetery preservation statutes." Bennett's face flushed with anger. "This is intimidation." "This is legal counsel," Hargrove corrected mildly. "As board members, you have fiduciary responsibility to the families who entrusted their loved ones to your care. Accepting financial incentives that require disturbing existing graves raises significant ethical and legal questions." He placed a final document before Hayes. "We've also taken the liberty of contacting the State Historical Society. Given that Riverside Cemetery contains Civil War veterans' graves, they've expressed interest in expediting historical landmark designation, which would prohibit any significant alterations to the grounds." Having delivered his message, Hargrove nodded respectfully to the board. "We'll leave you to your deliberations. Good evening." After they departed, the room remained silent for several moments. Hayes finally spoke, his voice subdued. "I move the table discussion of the Nexus proposal until our legal counsel can review these documents." The motion passed unanimously. Outside the cemetery office, Chen made a secure call to Margaret, while Hargrove waited nearby. "Phase 1 complete," she reported. "Proposal tabled indefinitely. Board members sufficiently concerned about personal liability to reconsider Nexus offer." "Good," Margaret replied. "And the cemetery surveillance? Our team confirms no suspicious activity. If Chambers was planning something here, he'll need to reconsider. Historical landmark application has been submitted with expedited processing requested. Understood. Return to base when you're finished. Chen ended the call and turned to Hargrove. Chambers' first counterattack has been neutralized. The former senator nodded approvingly. The cemetery approach was clumsy. Too public, too many variables. He's getting desperate, which makes him dangerous, Chen reminded him. Desperate opponents take greater risks. As if confirming her assessment, Chen's secure phone buzzed with an alert from Hawkins. Surveillance team detected approaching property from East Access Road. Implementing countermeasures, the four-man team from Sentinel Security Solutions moved with practiced efficiency through the wooded area bordering Margaret's farm. Dressed in dark clothing and equipped with night vision gear, they carried specialized surveillance equipment designed for covert deployment. Team 2 in position at the northeastern boundary, the leader reported via encrypted radio. Beginning device placement. Acknowledged, came the response from their operations coordinator, monitoring from a nondescript van parked a mile away on a service road. Proceed with package deployment. Remember, no crossing onto the target property. External perimeter. Only, the team began placing small camouflaged monitoring devices at strategic points. Each unit contained advanced audio capture capability, thermal imaging, and motion detection, all transmitting to a secure server through encrypted channels. Package 1 active, reported the specialist, after concealing the first device in a tree trunk with a clear view of the farmhouse driveway. The team continued their methodical deployment, unaware that every movement was being tracked by Hawkins' counter-surveillance system. Infrared drones silently monitored from high above, while ground-based sensors detected their positions with pinpoint accuracy. Inside the farmhouse, Hawkins tracked the team's progress on his equipment. 4 operators, standard corporate security. Pattern. They're placing surveillance devices along the eastern property line. Margaret studied the thermal signatures on Hawkins' monitor. They're being cautious, staying off my actual property. Legal deniability. Want me to disable their equipment? Hawkins asked. No, Margaret decided. Let them complete their deployment. We can use their devices to feed selective information when needed. After 40 minutes, the surveillance team had placed 8 monitoring devices in a semicircle around the eastern approach to the farmhouse. They retreated the way they had come, apparently satisfied with their undetected operation. Once they had departed, Hawkins pulled up detailed schematics of the devices they had placed, captured by his scanning equipment. Standard corporate espionage. Package, he assessed. Audio, visual, thermal, good equipment, but nothing we can't manage. Can you access their transmission feed? Margaret asked. Hawkins' fingers danced across his keyboard. Their encryption is decent but not government grade. Give me an hour to insert our interception protocols. Margaret nodded, then turned to Chen, who had just returned from the cemetery operation. Status update on all fronts, she requested. Chen consulted her tablet. Cemetery approach neutralized. Alliance patrols active on all major access roads. Weber reports the chemical shipment is still scheduled for tomorrow morning. Destination is a storage facility owned by a Nexus shell company. And Chambers? Returned to Nexus headquarters after our meeting. He's been there for 3 hours. Multiple secure communications detected. Margaret considered this information. He's coordinating his next move. The cemetery approach failed, but he still has the environmental contamination plan in motion. She walked to the kitchen window, gazing out at the darkened landscape of her farm. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, electronic eyes now watched her property, recording and transmitting. Another violation of her space, another reason to ensure Chambers understood the consequences of his actions. Let's give our observers something to report, she decided. Chen, contact Weber. I want a visible EPA presence on the property tomorrow morning. Official vehicles, agents in windbreakers, the full regulatory show. Psychological operation? Chen asked with approval. Exactly. Chambers needs to believe his time is running out. The more pressure he feels, the more likely he'll make a critical mistake. As her team implemented the revised strategy, Margaret found herself reflecting on how quickly the situation had escalated. What had begun with the tragic loss of Rex had evolved into a multi-layered conflict involving corporate espionage, environmental threats, community action, and the kind of tactical planning she hadn't engaged in since her active service days. James would have approached this differently. Her late husband had been the diplomatic one, the problem solver who looked for win-win solutions. But James wasn't here, and the men who had killed Rex and threatened her home hadn't been interested in diplomacy. In the quiet kitchen of the farmhouse her husband had lovingly restored, Margaret Voss made a silent promise. To James, to Rex, to herself, and to the land they had cherished together, Chambers and his corporation would not prevail. Whatever it took, whatever resources she needed to deploy, she would ensure that justice was served. The widow they had underestimated was awakening capabilities long dormant, and Victor Chambers was about to discover exactly what that meant. At Nexus headquarters, Chambers received the first surveillance reports from the farm with growing frustration. The images showed nothing more than a quiet rural property. Margaret Voss had retired for the night, lights in the farmhouse extinguished by 11 p.m. The security consultants remained on site, maintaining regular patrol patterns that suggested standard protective detail protocols, nothing extraordinary. No unusual communications detected, reported the Sentinel security team leader. Standard cellular and internet traffic only, no encrypted transmissions or satellite communications that would indicate significant outside support. Chambers frowned. What about the cemetery operation? Kieran, who had been monitoring that situation, hesitated before responding. Complications. The board tabled our proposal after receiving legal notifications from Blackwood Consulting. They've initiated historical landmark designation for the cemetery. Hargrove and his firm move quickly, Chambers observed, irritation evident in his tone. The widow's resources continue to exceed expectations. There's something else, Kieran added. Our sources at the county administrator's office report unusual activity. Several EPA vehicles were seen arriving this evening. The administrator claims no knowledge of federal environmental operations in the area. Chambers processed this information, connecting patterns that suggested coordinated opposition to his plans. The widow had leveraged legal, regulatory, and community resources with remarkable efficiency for someone supposedly operating as an individual property owner. The chemical solution becomes increasingly necessary, he concluded. If we can't acquire the land through financial or legal means, we ensure it becomes valueless to anyone, including Margaret Voss. Once contaminated, the property will require remediation beyond what an individual can afford. She'll have no choice but to sell at whatever price we offer. Kieran looked troubled by this approach. The liability risk is substantial. If traced back to Nexus, the criminal and civil penalties would be severe. Which is why absolute deniability is essential, Chambers replied sharply. The contractors handling the operation have no direct connection to us. Payment is routed through multiple shell companies. Nothing leads back to Nexus. He turned to the surveillance feeds again, studying the peaceful farmhouse with calculated assessment. Continue monitoring. If the widow's EPA connections materialize, tomorrow we accelerate the timeline. I want the contamination operation ready to execute at my signal. As midnight approached, both adversaries prepared for the next phase of their conflict. Margaret Voss, the underestimated widow whose dog's death had triggered a chain reaction neither side had anticipated. Victor Chambers, the corporate executive whose miscalculation had escalated a simple property acquisition into a multi-front battle with increasingly personal stakes. Between them lay not just a farm, but fundamental questions of power, justice, and the limits of what could be taken or defended when principles collided with profit. Dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold as Margaret completed her solitary walk around the property. These morning inspections had been part of her routine since James's passing, a quiet moment to connect with the land they had cherished together. Today, however, her attention focused on the surveillance devices Chambers' team had planted overnight, now marked on her tablet with glowing red indicators. "Breakfast is ready," Chen called from the porch as Margaret returned. Weber sent an update on the chemical shipment. Inside, Hawkins had transformed the dining room into a tactical operations center. Multiple screens displayed security camera, feeds, thermal imaging of the property perimeter, and real-time satellite imagery of the surrounding area. The delivery truck left the Nexus subsidiary facility 20 minutes ago, he reported, indicating a moving dot on one of his screens. Based on its trajectory, they're using the northern access road, less traffic, fewer potential witnesses. Margaret studied the map. Estimated arrival time? Approximately 40 minutes. They're maintaining legal speed limits. Nothing to attract attention. And our EPA visitors? Chen smiled slightly. Right on schedule. 2 official vehicles will arrive in 15 minutes. Weber arranged for actual agents, friends of his who owed favors. They'll conduct a visible but entirely unofficial inspection that should be quite convincing to Chambers' surveillance. Margaret nodded with satisfaction. Let's make sure his team gets plenty of footage. I want Chambers to believe the regulatory noose is tightening. As they finalized preparations, Margaret's secure phone rang. Earl Jenkins calling with his morning. "Report from the Alliance. Our patrol spotted something suspicious," the elderly farmer reported. "Unmarked white truck heading toward the valley on Route 16. Driver and passenger were wearing what looked like chemical handling gear." "You've got good eyes in your neighborhood watch," Margaret commented. "Can you redirect your patrols to the North Access Road? I want that truck to know it's being observed, but don't intercept." "Already on it," Earl confirmed. "Got 3 trucks with farm logos moving that direction now. Nothing suspicious about farmers checking their fields at dawn." After ending the call, Margaret turned to her team. "Time to spring our trap. Hawkins, initiate the surveillance feed manipulation. Let's give Chambers' team exactly what we want them to see." Hawkins typed a series of commands, activating the countermeasures they had prepared overnight. The surveillance devices planted around the property would now receive carefully crafted data, showing Margaret greeting EPA officials while appearing increasingly distressed by their findings. "And now," Margaret said with grim determination, "let's deal with our chemical delivery." In the monitoring van, parked discreetly on a service road overlooking the Voss property, Sentinel Security's surveillance team watched with growing concern as 2 vehicles with EPA markings pulled into the farmhouse driveway. "Alert Mr. Chambers immediately," the team leader instructed. "Federal regulatory presence confirmed on target property." At Nexus headquarters, Chambers received the news with controlled fury. The footage streaming to his office showed Margaret Voss in animated conversation with individuals wearing EPA windbreakers, gesturing toward the river boundary of her property. "They're conducting soil and water testing," reported the surveillance team. "Appears to be an official environmental assessment." Chambers turned to Kieran, who had been monitoring the situation alongside him. How did she manage this so quickly? Standard EPA response times for civilian complaints are weeks, not days. "Her connections are more extensive than we realized," Kieran acknowledged. "This changes our timeline significantly." Chambers paced the length of his office, calculations running through his mind. If the EPA established official interest in the property, his contamination strategy would backfire catastrophically. Environmental crimes investigations would lead directly to Nexus, regardless of how carefully he had constructed the deniability barriers. He made a swift decision. Contact the delivery team. Abort the operation immediately. Kieran moved to comply, but paused as her secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. Her expression tightened as she read it. The delivery team is reporting interference. Local vehicles are tracking their movements. They believe their approach has been compromised. Pull them out, Chambers ordered sharply. Complete withdrawal. Nothing connects to us. As Kieran relayed the instructions, Chambers returned his attention to the surveillance feed. Something about the EPA inspection bothered him. It seemed almost theatrical, too perfectly timed and visible to their surveillance. Zoom in on the agent's credentials, he instructed suddenly. The surveillance team compiled, focusing their equipment on the identification badges visible on the visitors' jackets. After a moment of image enhancement, the team leader reported, with confusion, "Sir, these appear to be legitimate EPA credentials. Names match known Environmental Enforcement Division personnel." Chambers' suspicion deepened. Margaret Voss had orchestrated federal regulatory presence on her property within hours of their confrontation. The level of influence required for such rapid response suggested connections far beyond what a retired military widow should possess. She knew, he realized aloud. She knew about the surveillance, about the chemical delivery. She's been one step ahead from the beginning. Kieran, who had just ended her call with the delivery team, looked up sharply. "Are you suggesting she has inside information about our operations?" Before Chambers could respond, his private line rang, the dedicated number known only to Nexus board members and critical operation leads. The caller ID displayed unknown, but he answered immediately. "Chambers," he stated crisply. "Good morning." "Mr. Chambers." Margaret Voss's voice was calm, almost pleasant. "I believe your chemical delivery team is experiencing some difficulties." Chambers froze, signaling Kieran to begin a trace on the call. "Mrs. Voss, this is unexpected." "Is it? I thought it might be time for us to speak directly, given your team's busy night planting surveillance around my property and your interesting morning delivery plans." "I don't know what you're talking about," Chambers replied automatically, though he knew denial was pointless. "Let's not waste time with pretenses," Margaret continued. "Your surveillance is compromised. Your cemetery strategy has failed. Your chemical sabotage attempt is being documented as we speak. And in approximately 30 minutes, the actual EPA, not my friends providing this morning's performance, will receive detailed documentation of Nexus Agricultural Technologies' systematic environmental violations across 3 counties. Chambers motioned to Kieran, who was already typing rapidly on her tablet, attempting to assess the extent of their exposure. "What do you want?" he asked directly, abandoning the corporate facade. "The same thing I wanted yesterday. For you and your corporation to leave my property alone, permanently, but given your persistence, I've been forced to expand my requirements." The calm confidence in her voice unsettled Chambers more than anger would have. This wasn't a desperate property owner making threats. This was a strategist executing a carefully constructed plan. "I'm listening," he said carefully. "First, Nexus will abandon all plans for the processing plant in this valley. Not relocated, not redesigned, cancelled entirely. Second, all properties already acquired will be restored to their original agricultural state and offered back to their former owners at purchase price. Third, you will personally resign as CEO of Nexus Agricultural Technologies, effective immediately." Chambers almost laughed at the audacity of her demands. "That's absurd. You're asking for the dismantling of a multi-million-dollar corporate initiative and my career based on what leverage exactly?" "The leverage of mutually assured destruction," Margaret replied evenly. "My associates have prepared 3 information packages. The first contains evidence of your corporation's environmental crimes, including the attempted sabotage of my property today. The second documents the intimidation tactics employed against multiple property owners, including the armed invasion of my home. The third, and this one should interest your board members particularly, details your personal financial arrangements with shell companies that have been overcharging Nexus for contracted services and funneling the difference to your offshore accounts. The blood drained from Chambers' face. The first two threats were concerning but potentially survivable with enough legal resources. The third was catastrophic because it was true. He had been skimming from corporate contracts for years, building a secret financial reserve as insurance against exactly this type of situation. That's preposterous, he managed, though his voice lacked conviction. The documentation is quite thorough, Margaret continued as if he hadn't spoken. Banking records, transfer authorizations, corporate minutes where you approved contracts to your own shell companies without disclosing your ownership interest. The board might forgive environmental shortcuts in pursuit of profit, Mr. Chambers. They're unlikely to forgive you for stealing from them. Kieran was watching him intently now, clearly registering his reaction to this unexpected revelation. You're bluffing, Chambers attempted, but the defense sounded hollow even to his own ears. Check your personal email, Margaret suggested. I've sent a sample of the documentation as a courtesy. Chambers turned to his computer, finding a new message from an anonymous address. The attached files contained exactly what she had described, internal financial records that could only have come from someone with access to his most secure files. How did you get this? He demanded, genuine shock replacing his calculated demeanor. You're not the only one with resources, Mr. Chambers. The moment you sent armed men onto my property, you triggered contingency protocols that James and I established years ago. My husband may have been a farmer when you knew him, but before that he worked in corporate intelligence. He kept files on everyone he ever investigated, including you. The revelation struck Chambers like a physical blow. James Voss, the name suddenly connected in his memory, not as Margaret's husband, the farmer, but as James Voss, the corporate intelligence specialist who had briefly investigated Nexus during a potential acquisition nearly 15 years ago. The investigation had been called off, but not before Voss had apparently uncovered Chambers' financial manipulations. James never trusted you, Margaret continued. He kept the files as insurance, hoping they'd never be needed. When he died, that insurance passed to me. Chambers' mind raced, calculating options, escape routes, deniability shields, finding none that would withstand the evidence she possessed. What guarantee do I have that you'll destroy this information if I comply? He asked finally. The same guarantee you gave the men who invaded my home, Margaret replied coldly. None at all. But unlike you, I keep my word. Meet my demands, and the information remains secured. Continue your campaign against my property, and it goes to your board, federal regulators, and the media simultaneously. The line went silent. As Chambers weighed his limited options, his entire career, his fortune, his freedom, balanced on the decision. You have until noon to begin implementation, Margaret concluded. I'll know if you're stalling. The call ended, leaving Chambers staring at his computer screen, where the damning financial records remained displayed. Kieran stood silent, awaiting direction. Have the delivery team stand down completely, he finally ordered. Recall all surveillance personnel. No further actions against the Voss property or associated alliance properties without my direct authorization. As Kieran moved to comply, Chambers turned to the window, gazing at the city skyline he had once viewed as a testament to his power. The widow whose dog his men had killed had outmaneuvered him completely, using his own tactics against him with devastating precision. He had one card left to play. The board might support him against external threats if he presented them correctly. But the financial evidence Margaret possessed would override any loyalty. His career at Nexus was effectively over. The question now was whether he could salvage his freedom and enough of his wealth to start again elsewhere. Back at the farmhouse, Margaret ended the call and turned to her team. "Chambers is cornered," she stated simply. "He'll attempt to negotiate with the board, but they'll abandon him once they verify the financial evidence." "You think he'll meet all your demands?" Hawkins asked. "He has no choice. The processing plant is dead, his pet project destroyed by his own tactics. His career at Nexus is over. The only question is whether he sacrifices himself gracefully or forces us to release everything." Chen studied Margaret with newfound respect. The financial evidence, that was James's insurance policy. Margaret nodded, her expression softening at the mention of her husband. James investigated Nexus years ago when another company was considering acquisition. He discovered Chambers' embezzlement scheme but couldn't prove it definitively before the acquisition was abandoned. He kept monitoring, gathering evidence over years, sensing that someday Chambers might become a threat. "He was protecting you, even then," Chen observed. "We protected each other," Margaret corrected gently. "That's what partnership means." She walked to the window, gazing out at the farm that had been their sanctuary and was now the battleground of a conflict neither had anticipated. "Have our people keep watch on the chemical delivery team," she instructed. "Ensure they leave the area completely, and maintain surveillance on Nexus headquarters. I want to know the moment Chambers makes his move." Margaret received these updates from Weber, whose sources within Nexus confirmed that Chambers had departed the corporate headquarters for the last time, escorted by security personnel who had once answered to his commands. "The board is in damage control mode," Weber reported. "They're distancing themselves from Chambers and his initiatives. The processing plant project has been officially suspended, though they're calling it a strategic reassessment publicly." "And the property's already acquired?" Margaret asked. "Legal is preparing options for the board. Restoration and resale to original owners is being presented as a community goodwill initiative to repair relationships in the valley." Margaret smiled at the corporate spin. "They'll do the right thing for the wrong reasons. That's often the best you can hope for with entities like Nexus." "What about Chambers himself?" Chen asked. "He still poses a potential threat." Weber's voice conveyed satisfaction. "Our sources indicate he's taken a corporate jet to the Cayman Islands, where coincidentally many of his hidden assets are stored. Given the evidence against him, it's unlikely he'll risk returning to challenge the outcome." "And the contractors who invaded my home? The man who shot Rex?" Margaret's voice hardened slightly at the memory. "Local authorities have been provided with evidence connecting them to the incident, anonymized to protect your privacy. Arrests are expected within 48 hours. Margaret nodded, satisfied that justice would be served through proper channels. The organization that had come to her aid had fulfilled their promise to James, protecting his widow when threats materialized. Now they would recede into the background, returning to the shadows from which they operated. "Thank you, Weber," she said sincerely, "for everything." "James was family to us," Weber replied simply. "That makes you family too. We protect our own." After the call ended, Margaret sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Chen and Hawkins had departed an hour earlier, their mission complete. The farmhouse was quiet once more. In the morning, Margaret would call Earl Jenkins and the other Alliance members to share the news of their victory. Together, they had protected not just her farm, but the entire valley from corporate exploitation. The community bonds forged through adversity would remain, strengthening the connections between neighbors who had stood together against a common threat. For now, though, Margaret simply absorbed the peaceful evening. feeling James's presence, in the gentle creaking of the porch swing he had built, in the rustling leaves of trees he had planted, in the enduring sanctuary they had created together. Her gaze drifted to Rex's grave marker, visible in the fading light. The faithful companion whose death had sparked a conflict that Chambers could never have anticipated when he sent armed men to intimidate what he thought was just a vulnerable widow. "They underestimated us, boys," she said softly to the evening air, addressing both her husband and her dog. "They always do." As darkness settled over the farm that would now remain her home for as long as she chose, Margaret Voss, widow, veteran, defender, allowed herself to truly relax for the first time since the sound of a gunshot had shattered the night and awakened capabilities long dormant. The battle was won, the land was secure, and those who had threatened what she loved had learned a costly lesson about the mistake of shooting a widow's dog, especially when that dog's death was the signal to start fighting back. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.